The gate to freedom was wide open, but the baby elephant broke down and refused to take a single step. The experts tried everything, yet he kept turning back toward an old holding pen, as if someone were slowly dying in the dark. Then, the night footage revealed a secret that left everyone shaken. For nights, he had been standing watch there, and when the truth finally came out, they realized he wasn't afraid of freedom at all. He was staying behind to say goodbye to the one who had helped save him after his mother was killed. By the time his heartbreaking cry echoed through the preserve on that final night, everyone understood they were witnessing a kind of love most people never imagined an animal could carry to the very end. Dawn came slowly over the northern Botswana preserve, spilling pale gold across the grasslands and turning the dust in the air to drifting amber. At the far edge of the release enclosure, a young elephant named Milo stood beneath the open sky, still as carved stone. The steel gate beside him had already rolled wide, leaving nothing between him and the wild but a few yards of red earth. For 7 long months, that open gate had been the promise waiting at the end of his pain. The humans had spoken of it in soft voices, in careful routines, in the quiet confidence of people who believed healing always moved forward. Milo had grown stronger under their care. The limp in his front leg was gone. His appetite had returned. His eyes had learned how to hold light again. And yet, when the morning finally arrived, he did not move. He did not lift 1 foot toward freedom. He did not test the wind beyond the fence or reach his trunk toward the acacia line in the distance. He only stood there, trembling faintly, his ears hanging low, his wet eyes fixed somewhere behind him, as if the world he could not leave was not the one ahead, but the one at his back. A sound rose from deep inside his chest, so low at first that the nearest handlers felt it, more than heard it. It rolled through the ground like a buried current, a long, aching rumble that did not belong to panic. It sounded older than fear. Milo let it out in pulses, each one softer than the last, as if he were calling to someone too far away to answer, or too weak to answer back. From the observation platform, Dr. Hannah Cole lowered the clipboard in her hand and stared in silence. She had released antelope, lions, cheetahs, even elephants, older and more damaged than Milo. Some had bolted the instant the gates opened. Some had hesitated, but none had ever stood like this, crying without tears anyone could name, rooted to the threshold as though one more step might break something invisible inside him. Ethan Brooks tried first. He kept his distance, speaking in the calm voice Milo knew from evening walks and feeding rounds. He set down slices of melon just outside the gate, bright against the dirt, then backed away. Milo noticed them. His trunk lifted, tasting sweetness, on the breeze. But instead of reaching forward, he turned halfway around and looked toward the rear service lane, toward the old buildings beyond the main enclosure wall. Lila Grant caught that movement through her camera lens and felt a chill she could not explain. She had been filming Milo for nearly 3 weeks, learning the tiny shifts in his body the way some people learned a language. This was not simple refusal. It was attention. He was listening for something, waiting for something. Every few seconds, his trunk rose and angled behind him, searching the air near the old corridor of unused holding pens. Noah Reed checked the monitors again, more out of habit than necessity. Milo's vitals were steady enough. No fever, no sign of acute distress, no injury severe enough to explain this paralysis. "He's physically fine," he said, though even he no longer sounded convinced that physical readiness meant much. Milo gave another low cry, then took a half-step sideways, not toward the gate, but toward the shadow cast by the enclosure wall. The preserve around him was waking fully now. Birds lifted from the thorn trees in restless bursts. Somewhere farther off, a herd moved through brush with the dry crackle of branches underweight. Freedom was not silent. It was calling in 100 living voices, but Milo would not answer. He rocked once on his feet, then pressed the tip of his trunk to the ground, holding it there as if the earth itself carried news the humans could not hear. Hannah signaled the team to stop crowding him. The gate remained open, but the hope surrounding it had begun to thin into unease. Workers who had gathered for the release drifted back a few steps, trading glances they did not voice aloud. Even Grace Holloway, the donor representative dressed for celebration in a linen shirt too white for the dust, said nothing now. Milo's grief had changed the air around all of them. Minutes became nearly an hour. The sun climbed. Heat gathered along Milo's back, tracing the shape of old scars hidden beneath new skin. Still, he refused the gate. Once, he stretched his trunk toward the wild and inhaled deeply, and for a breath it seemed he might go. But then his whole body tensed. He turned again toward the rear of the compound, and a broken, childlike rumble slipped out of him, raw enough to stop Ethan in place. Lila lowered her camera for the first time that morning. Through the quiet, she became aware of another detail that made her pulse jump. Milo was not just looking behind him. He was looking toward a section of the preserve no one used anymore. A row of older service structures beyond a rusted maintenance fence. One of the far units had been decommissioned after renovations. According to the maps, it was empty. But Milo watched it like it mattered. Hannah finally gave the order no one expected on a release day. Close the gate. Not forever, just for now. The metal barrier rolled shut with a slow, mechanical groan, and Milo did not protest. If anything, some of the strain left his body. He exhaled, long and shaky, then turned fully away from the world beyond the fence. Step by step, he moved deeper into the enclosure, toward the back corner, toward whatever invisible thread had held him there all morning. By the time he reached the shaded side of the habitat, the triumphant mood of release day was gone. In its place was a question none of them could shake. Milo had not refused the wild because he was weak. He had refused because something in this place still owned a piece of his heart. And as Lila glanced toward the abandoned holding wing beyond the wall, she felt the first cold edge of a truth waiting in the dark. The enclosure felt smaller the morning after the failed release, though nothing in it had changed except the way everyone looked at Milo. The gate was shut again, the celebration table had been cleared away, and the white banner meant for photographs was gone. Only the young elephant remained in the same uneasy rhythm, pacing a few steps, then stopping to stare toward the back of the compound. At first light, Hannah returned before the others and found him standing in the same place he had chosen the evening before, angled toward the old service wing beyond the rear fence. He was not agitated in the ordinary sense. He was listening. Every few seconds his trunk lifted, not toward the wind over the grasslands, but toward the cluster of unused buildings, half hidden by thornbrush and rusted mesh. He should have been restless for the world outside. That was what recovery was supposed to lead to. Instead, Milo moved through the enclosure, as if tethered to an invisible point somewhere behind him. He wandered only so far before circling back. Even when the other elephants called from distant pens, he answered faintly, then let the sound die in his throat, distracted by something the humans still could not see. Noah arrived with charts and a cooler of supplements, prepared to prove what he still wanted to believe, that the problem was behavioral, temporary, manageable. He checked Milo's appetite, pulse, gait, and hydration markers one more time. Nothing was wrong on paper. The young elephant was healthy enough to leave, strong enough to survive, alert enough to learn. But every clean number only deepened the mystery now growing around him. Ethan tried next, patient in the way only someone who had worked around wounded animals for years could be. He opened the side lane and walked ahead at a respectful distance, giving Milo space to follow if he chose. For a moment, it seemed possible. Milo took 2 slow steps forward, ears twitching, trunk stretched low. Then he froze, swung around sharply, and backed away with a low, pained rumble that sounded almost ashamed. By midday, they had tried all the gentle methods they trusted. Ethan laid out squash, melons, and the salt cakes Milo usually loved. Hannah ordered playback of distant elephant calls from a field speaker outside the main gate. A younger female from a nearby enclosure was led close enough to offer calm company through the fence. Milo noticed every one of these efforts. He simply refused to give his heart to them. Lila watched through the zoom lens and began noticing a pattern the others had missed in the exhaustion of release day. Milo would approach food only after glancing over his shoulder, as though checking whether something behind him still remained in place. If the tray was set near the front gate, he ignored it. If Ethan quietly moved it toward the back half of the enclosure, Milo would eventually eat, but only with one eye turned away. That detail landed heavily on Hannah. Fear usually scattered attention. Trauma made animals flinch from shadows, noise, hands, movement. But Milo's behavior was focused, almost purposeful. He was not avoiding the world at random. He was organizing himself around one fixed direction, one area of interest, one private obligation no one else understood. The realization disturbed her more than panic would have. In the hottest part of the afternoon, when the preserve shimmered under white sunlight and even the birds fell quiet, Milo pressed the tip of his trunk to the dirt and stood still for so long that Lila lowered the camera in worry. Then he let out another low vibration, softer than the day before, but somehow sadder, and moved toward the rear fence with a tenderness that made the motion feel less like searching and more like mourning. Grace Holloway, who had come expecting a polished conservation success story, asked the question no one wanted to answer. Was Milo too bonded to the sanctuary to be released at all? Noah almost agreed. It would have been the easiest explanation, the cleanest one for reports and funding notes. But Hannah shook her head. Dependency looked needy. This looked like devotion, and devotion always had an object. Late in the day, a groundskeeper named Ben Alvarez passed by the observation rail and hesitated when he heard them mention the old back wing. Ben had worked at the preserve longer than most of the younger staff. He frowned and said the section had once housed overflow cases during a renovation transfer, but the records from that month were messy. A few animals had been shifted more than once. Some paperwork had never been fully reconciled. That single remark changed the room inside Hannah's mind. Lila heard it too, and looked immediately toward the rear structures, where the sun was now dropping behind the roofs and filling the corridor windows with red light. Milo had moved closer than ever to that side of the enclosure. He stood by the fence line, swaying slightly, his trunk reaching through the wire toward the darkening buildings as if he could bridge the distance by will alone. That evening, long after feeding rounds ended and the preserve settled into the blue hush before night, Lila carried the camera drives into the small media room beside the infirmary. She told herself she was only reviewing release footage for documentation. But as the first grainy images flickered across the screen and Milo's midnight silhouette appeared near the old service wing, a colder certainty began to form. Outside, the young elephant remained awake under the stars. The others were bedding down, but Milo stood facing the same direction, quiet now, almost reverent. Whatever had held him at the gate still had him. And as Lila leaned closer to the glowing monitor, she understood with a tightening in her chest that tomorrow was no longer about release. Tomorrow was about finding out who, or what, Milo refused to leave behind. Night settled over the preserve in layers, cooling the dust, softening the fences, and drawing long shadows around the quiet buildings at the back of the compound. In the dim blue light, Milo did not lie down. He stood near the rear boundary of his enclosure, body angled toward the abandoned service wing, as if sleep belonged to other creatures and not to him. From the media room beside the infirmary, Lila replayed the footage again and again. At 2:17 a.m., the timestamp glowed pale in the corner of the screen. Milo appeared from the far side of the habitat and walked with strange certainty to the rear fence. He did not pace or wander. He went straight to one section of wire, lowered his head, and remained there as still as prayer. She leaned closer. Grain and darkness swallowed most of the frame, but not everything. Once her eyes adjusted, she noticed a faint movement beyond the fence line, deep in the corridor between two disused holding units. It was small, almost nothing, just the suggestion of shape where the dark should have stayed flat. Yet Milo reacted to it. His trunk lifted, then stretched forward with heartbreaking care. Lila called Ethan first, because she knew he would come without brushing it off. He arrived half-zipped into a field jacket, rubbing sleep from his eyes, then stopped cold when she froze the frame and pointed. For several seconds, he said nothing. The old service wing was supposed to be empty. Even from a distance, that much seemed obvious now. Milo had not been staring into nothing. Something was there. By the time Hannah joined them, Noah had also been pulled from his bunk, carrying the kind of guarded skepticism that belonged to trained professionals trying not to leap ahead of facts. They watched the clip in silence. Milo's body language was unlike anything from the main enclosure. He was gentle there, attentive, not frightened. At one point, he even shifted his weight and lowered himself slightly, the way a calf might when approaching an elder. Outside, the preserve had gone almost completely still. Somewhere beyond the acacias, hyenas called and fell quiet again. Hannah studied the screen, then looked through the window toward the dark rear compound. "We check it at first light," she said. Ethan wanted to go immediately, but she shook her head. If something or someone was back there, rushing blind into a half-abandoned wing at night could make a bad situation worse. Milo remained awake until dawn. Ben Alvarez, making the last perimeter round before sunrise, saw him from the maintenance lane and later swore the young elephant never once turned toward the main gate. He stood with one forefoot slightly lifted, as if he wanted to move and would not allow himself to. Just before morning, Ben heard a low vibration in the air, too deep to be sound at first, more like grief moving through metal. At first light, a thin silver fog hung low over the ground, and the old back wing looked even lonelier than it had in daylight before. Rust bled down the hinges of the service doors. Dry weeds pressed against the fencing. One shattered window had been covered in plywood that now curled at the edges. Milo watched from the far side of his enclosure, tense and silent, every bit of his attention fixed on the team gathering near the locked corridor. Hannah led the way with Ethan beside her, Noah carrying a medkit, and Lila following with a camera she no longer raised to eye level. This no longer felt like documentation. It felt like trespassing into a sorrow someone else had been keeping. Ben worked the outer latch loose, then forced the old gate inward. The hinges let out a tired, broken shriek that made Milo flinch behind them. The smell hit first. Damp hay, old disinfectant, rust, and underneath it all the unmistakable weight of illness. Not death, not yet, but something moving in that direction. The corridor was narrow and dim, with streaks of light cutting through gaps in the roof. Hannah moved carefully past empty stalls and stacked crates from the renovation months earlier. Then Ethan stopped so suddenly that Noah nearly walked into him. In the deepest corner of the final holding bay, half hidden behind warped divider panels, lay an elephant. She was old, far older than Milo's mother had been. Her skin slack over prominent bone, one torn ear folded against the straw. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Her eyes were half closed. Yet, at the sound of footsteps, she stirred, and from outside the corridor came an answer. Milo's low, trembling rumble, immediate and full of recognition. Lila felt every hair on her arms rise. The old elephant lifted her trunk only an inch or two, but it was enough. Enough to show intention. Enough to show she had been listening too. Hannah was beside her in an instant, kneeling in the straw, clinical training taking over even as shock moved through her face. Fever, dehydration, pressure sores, an infection obvious even before blood work. This was not a healthy resident tucked away in error. This was neglect hidden by chaos. Noah found the faded intake tag clipped to the stall ledger outside, curled and stained from months of dust. The name written there made Ben swear under his breath. Ruby. The old female from the emergency transfer during the poaching surge. She had been classed non-releasable because of her age and injuries. During the renovation shuffle, she had been moved temporarily, then somehow left off the active care grid when units were reassigned. No one spoke for a long moment. Beyond the corridor wall, Milo's rumble came again, softer now, almost relieved. He had known all along. While the humans prepared him for freedom, measured his progress, and celebrated his survival, he had been keeping watch over someone they had forgotten. Hannah looked from Ruby's labored breathing to the shadow of Milo waiting on the other side of the fence, and the truth settled over the group with devastating force. The mystery of the gate was gone now, but what replaced it was worse. Milo had not refused the wild because he was weak, confused, or afraid of the open land beyond the fence. He had refused because in this neglected corner of the preserve, an old elephant lay fading toward death, and somewhere deep within his young heart, leaving her behind, had never been an option. By noon, the whole preserve seemed to move around the secret that had finally come to light. Word spread quietly, not in gossip, but in the stunned silences of people passing one another with lowered voices and unfinished thoughts. Milo remained at the rear fence, his body turned toward Ruby's hidden stall, calmer now that the humans had at last seen what he had been trying to tell them. Hannah ordered the old holding bay opened fully and had the rusted divider panels removed to let in air and light. As the workers moved with unusual care, Milo followed every sound from the other side of the fence, his trunk raised, testing each shift in scent. He no longer cried in those broken, searching rumbles from the day before. Now his calls were softer, steadier, as though recognition itself had eased a burden. Noah worked quickly, though the strain around his mouth betrayed what the first examination had already told him. Ruby's fever was high. One of her forelegs carried old scar tissue from a deep wound that had healed badly. Her breathing rasped with the effort of each inhale, and her body condition suggested she'd been declining for longer than anyone wanted to admit. This was no short-term setback. This was an animal losing ground day by day. Lila stood in the doorway with her camera hanging forgotten against her chest. The old elephant looked impossibly frail for a creature that should have felt monumental. Yet there was something intact in Ruby that sickness had not erased. When Milo rumbled from outside, her eyelid flickered and the tip of her trunk shifted over the straw, searching. That tiny response struck harder than any dramatic collapse could have. She knew him. She had been listening for him too. Ben brought over storage boxes from the administrative shed, and together they started digging through intake records from the emergency transfer months earlier. Pages were misfiled, clipped under the wrong dates, or marked with notes from staff who had since rotated out. In the middle of the mess, Ethan found the field rescue log from the poaching site. It had only a few blurred photographs attached, but they were enough to stop the room cold. In one image, taken at dusk beside a churned patch of mud and trampled brush, Milo stood pressed against the body of his dead mother. Just behind him, half collapsed but still upright, was Ruby. Blood darkened one side of her shoulder. Her trunk was stretched toward the calf, not away from him. In another frame, taken minutes later, Milo had shifted closer to her flank. Even in shock, even in terror, he had chosen her. That changed everything. Ruby was not just some forgotten patient from the same transport. She was part of the first fragile bridge between Milo and survival. While his world had been breaking open beside his mother's body, this older female had remained there with him. Whatever passed between elephants in those final hours on the savannah had not disappeared when the trucks arrived. It had followed them both into captivity and stayed alive in silence. Noah read more from the intake sheets, his voice growing quieter with each line. During Milo's first week at the preserve, staff had noted that his panic lessened at night when housed near the temporary overflow wing. Another note mentioned low-frequency vocal exchanges between two adjacent units, but the observation had never been fully explored because the center was overloaded and triage came first. The pattern had been documented, then buried under urgent work. By late afternoon, a new tension gripped the team. The practical question could no longer be avoided. Ruby needed immediate palliative care, possibly even round-the-clock supervision. Milo, meanwhile, had missed his release window and might miss a larger migration opportunity if they delayed too long. Grace Holloway, who had stayed on far longer than planned, finally voiced what funding boards would inevitably ask. Could the preserve afford to stop everything for a bond they had only just uncovered? Ethan answered before Hannah could. "It's not some sentimental story," he said, sharper than usual. He was trying to tell us she was dying. The words hung in the heat between them. Lila looked toward Milo, who had gone completely still at the sound of raised voices. Even from a distance, he seemed to feel when tension changed shape around Ruby. His ears lifted once, then lowered again, and he gave a soft rumble toward the stall like reassurance. Hannah did not respond right away. She stepped inside Ruby's bay and crouched beside the old elephant again, one hand resting lightly near the ridge of her shoulder. Ruby's skin was hot beneath the dust. Her eyes opened only halfway, but when Milo called, a nearly invisible tremor moved through her trunk. Hannah had spent years teaching teams to focus on outcomes, timelines, measurable readiness. Yet kneeling there, she understood that no release protocol had prepared them for this. As sunset pressed long bars of amber light across the corridor floor, the first real decision was made. Ruby would not stay hidden another night. The back panels between her stall and the adjoining service run would be removed, creating a safer line of contact between her and Milo through reinforced barrier space. It was not enough to reunite them fully, not yet, but it was enough to stop forcing their bond through walls and distance. When the workers finished and stepped away, Milo approached the new opening with such care that no one dared move. Ruby lay motionless at first. Then, slowly, she lifted her trunk. The gap between them was narrow, separated by steel mesh and years of human misunderstanding, but it was close enough. Milo reached through first, trembling, and when their trunks finally touched, the entire corridor fell silent around them, as if every person there understood they were witnessing a reunion too, sacred to interrupt. The sound Milo made then was unlike the cries of the release morning. It was lower, fuller, and unbearably gentle. Ruby answered with a faint vibration of her own, fragile as paper, but unmistakable. No one needed another explanation after that. The refusal at the gate, the sleepless nights, the fixed stare toward the abandoned wing, all of it had been love, translated into patience. And now that the truth stood in the open, a harder question began to rise. How much time did they have left? The preserve woke under a washed-out sky, the kind of pale morning that made every fence line look thinner and every silence feel heavier. Milo was already standing at the mesh before anyone arrived, his small body angled toward Ruby, with the fixed devotion of something deeper than habit. He did not test the gate again. He did not look toward the grasslands, for now his world had narrowed to the weak rise and fall of Ruby's breathing. Hannah ordered the release schedule, suspended, at least on paper, though saying the words aloud cost her more than she expected. The decision traveled quickly through radios, office doors, and clipped phone calls with people who preferred neat plans and measurable outcomes. But out at the holding run, none of that language seemed to matter. Milo reached through the barrier as far as he could, touching Ruby's cheek, then the edge of her ear, as though reassuring himself she was still there. Noah spent the morning running tests he already feared would confirm the obvious. Infection markers were high. Ruby's hydration was poor despite emergency fluids. Her heart was compensating, but only barely, and one of her old injuries had likely done damage that no one could reverse now. When he finally straightened from the monitor and looked at Hannah, he did not need to say much. Ruby was not recovering. At best, they were buying her comfort. At worst, only time. Lila sat on an overturned supply crate near the corridor and pieced together old intake photos with updated care logs spread across her knees. The story was coming into focus in painful fragments. Milo and Ruby had not simply arrived on the same transport. During the first week after rescue, they had repeatedly been documented vocalizing at night from neighboring units. One exhausted volunteer had even scribbled a note in the margin: "Calf settles when older female rumbles." That line stayed with her. It carried more truth than the polished reports ever had. Somewhere between emergency triage, staff turnover, and the endless urgency of wildlife medicine, a bond had been recognized, then filed away, then lost. Milo had never lost it. He had carried it intact through healing sessions, feeding routines, and months of preparation for a freedom he now refused. The adults had mistaken readiness in his body for peace in his heart. By early afternoon, the conflict no one wanted could no longer be postponed. Grace Holloway joined Hannah in the office with funding briefs tucked under one arm and the strained smile of someone trying to remain diplomatic. The migration window for release would not stay open forever. A delay could affect transport, tracking support, public reporting, and future grants. Grace chose her words carefully, but the meaning was clear enough. Compassion had a cost, and someone would eventually ask who planned to pay it. Ethan, who had no patience left for polished pressure, met her outside before she could leave. He had spent the morning repairing part of the rear fence just to keep his hands busy, and dust still clung to his arms when he spoke. "You can write whatever report you need," he said, keeping his voice low. "But if that calf walks away now, it'll break him." Grace started to answer, then stopped. Behind them, Milo let out a soft rumble that seemed to settle the argument more than words. As the day deepened, Ruby weakened in ways that were difficult to watch and impossible to ignore. Her breaths grew shallower. She no longer tried to shift her weight. But whenever Milo called, some hidden reserve in her still answered. The movement was slight. A tremor through her trunk, a faint roll in her throat, once a slow opening of one eye. But each response seemed to tell Milo that he was not too late. He stayed pressed to the barrier, steadfast as a promise. Near dusk, a dry wind moved across the preserve and carried the smell of rain from somewhere far off. Milo reacted before the humans did. He grew restless, pacing the length of the mesh, then returning to Ruby with visible urgency, touching her face, her shoulder, the straw near her mouth. He was not panicking. He was trying to manage something bigger than himself. Hannah watched quietly and began to understand that grief had already entered the enclosure long before death arrived. That evening, another piece of the truth surfaced. Ben Alvarez found an old voice memo on a damaged field tablet that had never been uploaded into the main archive. It came from the night Milo and Ruby were first brought in. A tired female staffer, likely speaking for later review, described the calf refusing food until the older cow vocalized from the next bay. "He settles when she's near," the voice said. "Looks to her like he knows her." Then the recording ended. Noah listened to it twice without speaking. His training had taught him to be suspicious of human projection, of sentiment dressed up as science. But there was no denying the pattern anymore. Milo was not acting out a childish dependency. He was maintaining a relationship that had probably helped keep him alive. In the wild, an orphaned calf without a stabilizing adult often spiraled fast into stress, confusion, or predation. Ruby may not have saved his body from poachers, but she had almost certainly steadied his mind afterward. When night finally came, Hannah gathered the team in the dim conference room and made the decision official. Milo's release would be postponed indefinitely. Ruby would receive palliative care only, focused on easing pain rather than chasing a cure that no longer existed. No one argued this time. Even Grace, after a long silence, only nodded and closed her folder. Outside, the first distant thunder rolled across the flat, dark land, and the preserve seemed to brace with it. They moved Ruby onto deeper bedding and adjusted the side run so Milo could remain close through the night. He would not eat until the work was done. He watched every blanket, every fluid line, every careful human hand, with a vigilance that bordered on reverence. Only once Ruby was settled did he finally lower his trunk to the small pile of greens Ethan laid nearby. He took a few mouthfuls, then turned back at once, as if nourishment mattered only if it allowed him to keep watch longer. Long after the staff lights dimmed, Lila remained by the window of the corridor with her camera untouched in her lap. Beyond the mesh, Milo stood, beside Ruby in a hush so complete it felt sacred. He reached through once more and rested the curve of his trunk against her forehead. Ruby answered with the faintest vibration, nearly too soft to catch. It was not recovery. It was not rescue. It was something smaller, sadder, and somehow more powerful. The beginning of a goodbye neither of them was willing to rush. Rain came just after midnight, first as a whisper over the corrugated roofs, then as a steady drumming that wrapped the preserve in darkness and sound. Most of the animals settled deeper into shelter, but Milo did not. He remained beside the mesh, one flank wet with windblown mist, his eyes fixed on Ruby as lightning flickered far beyond the acacia line. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world rinsed and strangely fragile. Pools of water gathered in tire ruts and shallow dips along the service lane. Milo stood exactly where the night had left him, his trunk threaded through the barrier as far as it would go. Ruby's breathing was thinner now, each inhale delayed just long enough to make the humans watching feel the empty space between one breath and the next. Hannah canceled every non-essential task and reassigned 2 handlers to the rear corridor. The rest of the preserve still needed feeding, cleaning, records, medicine, but something in the center of the day had shifted around Milo and Ruby. Even the radio chatter softened when it passed that end of the compound. It felt less like a medical wing now, and more like a vigil that everyone had entered without meaning to. Milo seemed to understand that time had changed shape. He no longer paced or called in confused bursts. Instead, his movements became deliberate, almost tender in their restraint. When Ruby stirred, he touched her face. When she lay still too long, he rumbled low and steady until the faintest tremor answered from her chest or throat. He was not trying to wake her fully. He was trying to keep her company inside the narrowing world she had left. Ethan brought fresh-cut branches from the eastern grove and laid them where Milo could reach them. The calf took some for himself, but after a few bites, he began lifting softer leaves through the mesh, dropping them as close to Ruby's mouth as the barrier allowed. It was clumsy and heartbreakingly earnest. Sometimes the leaves fell short, sometimes they brushed her cheek and slid into the straw. Still, he kept trying, patient, as if kindness itself required repetition. Lila filmed only in fragments now. The instinct to document remained, but the need to honor what she was seeing had grown larger than the impulse to capture every second. Once, through her lens, she watched Milo angle his body so the afternoon sun no longer fell directly on Ruby's face. He stood there for nearly 40 minutes, casting her in shade without moving, a young elephant making himself into shelter because there was nothing else he could do. Noah adjusted pain medication and checked Ruby's temperature again, though numbers mattered less with each passing hour. He had stopped speaking in the clipped, procedural language that once gave him distance from grief. Standing beside Hannah, he admitted what both of them already knew. Ruby was not waiting for medicine to work. She was moving toward an ending at her own pace, held together by comfort, instinct, and perhaps by the simple fact that Milo still refused to leave her. Around noon, Grace returned from a call with the board in Gaborone, her expression tense from arguments no one else had heard. She expected resistance when she entered the rear corridor. Instead, she found silence, Milo's trunk resting over Ruby's neck, and Hannah seated on an overturned bucket, as if keeping watch in a chapel. Whatever Grace had come prepared to say dissolved before she reached the stall. She stood for a long moment, then quietly asked if there was anything the team needed. The answer was simple: time, privacy, and less interference. For the first time since the failed release, everyone seemed to understand the same truth. Milo was not being delayed from his future. He was finishing something essential before he could survive it. The preserve had spent months preparing his body to rejoin the wild, but none of those protocols had accounted for this. An orphan deciding that love, once given, could not be abandoned just because the calendar demanded movement. Later that afternoon, another storm front gathered on the horizon, dark and bruised beneath the lowering sky. Wind pushed through the back corridor, lifting loose straw and rattling the old tin guttering overhead. The handlers moved to secure tarps and close side panels, but Milo reacted before any of them. He stepped between the draft and Ruby's bedding, turning his body broadside to the gusts. Rain began to slash sideways through the open run, and he stood there taking it. Water ran down his shoulders and darkened the dust along his spine. Ruby could not rise, could not shift, could not protect herself from the chill that came with the storm. So Milo became a wall. He held his place with a steadiness that no training could have taught, absorbing wind and wet while keeping his trunk curled close enough to touch her whenever she stirred. Lila would later think that of all the things she saw, that was the moment that broke her open. When the worst of the rain passed, Ethan and Ben moved in to reinforce the sheeting, but Milo would not fully step away until the corridor was dry again around Ruby's head and shoulders. Only then did he relax, shivering faintly, and let Ethan spread warm hay closer to the barrier. Hannah watched him with tears. She did not bother hiding anymore. This was no sentimental illusion laid over animal behavior. This was devotion, made visible through choice after choice after choice. Night came softly after the storm, wrapped in the smell of wet earth and cooling grass. Ruby slept more than she woke, but every now and then her trunk shifted toward Milo, finding him by touch. He answered each time with a low vibration, quieter now, less like a call and more like a promise. In the dim corridor light, with the preserve hushed around them, the humans understood they were no longer waiting to see whether Ruby would recover. They were witnessing how Milo intended to love her all the way to the edge. The seventh day began under a white, windless sky, the kind that seemed to pause the whole preserve before heat could settle in. Nothing dramatic announced itself at first. No sudden collapse, no frantic movement. Only a growing stillness around Ruby, as if her body had already begun stepping away from the world while the rest of her remained behind long enough to listen for Milo. He sensed the change before anyone said a word. That morning, he did not touch the greens Ethan placed beside the mesh. He did not wander to the water trough until Hannah herself coaxed him with a soft voice from several yards away. Even then, he drank only briefly before returning at once to Ruby's side, pressing the curve of his trunk against her cheek, as though counting each breath as it came. Noah checked her again just after sunrise, though the examination had become more ritual than intervention. Ruby's temperature had dropped. Her pulse was weak and irregular. The infection that had smoldered for months no longer needed numbers to declare itself. It lived plainly now in the long pauses between breaths and the way her eyelids barely fluttered when the corridor filled with light. When Noah looked up, Hannah already understood. There would be no recovery from this day. The news moved through the staff in silence. Ben set fresh straw near the stall and then walked away to hide the tears that caught him by surprise. Grace canceled 2 outside meetings without being asked. Lila stood with her camera at her side, unable to bring herself to lift it. Even Ethan, who usually answered pain with motion, repairs, feeding rounds, work of any kind, remained still beside the rail with one hand tight around the wire. Milo stayed where he had chosen to be, close enough that his breath sometimes stirred the loose skin along Ruby's ear. His own calls had changed again. They were no longer searching, no longer urgent. Each low rumble rose from him with deep, measured calm, like something meant not to summon help, but to offer company. Whenever Ruby drifted too far into stillness, he gave that sound again, and somewhere inside her, something answered. By midday, the preserve had fallen into an almost unnatural hush. Birds quieted in the thorn trees. The distant enclosures, usually restless with movement and intermittent calls, seemed subdued, as if the mood had traveled farther than sight. Hannah ordered all unnecessary traffic rerouted away from the rear corridor. No raised voices, no machinery, no interruptions. If Ruby's final hours belonged to anyone, they belonged first to her, and to the calf, who refused to abandon her. As the afternoon light turned softer, Ruby stirred with more effort than strength. Her trunk lifted only an inch, then slipped back to the straw. Milo immediately leaned closer, threading his own trunk through the mesh until it rested along the ridge of her forehead. The contact transformed him. Every tremor left his body. He became absolutely still, ears lowered, eyes half closed, as if the smallest movement might tear something fragile between them. Hannah prepared one final dose of pain medication and administered it with hands steadier than her heart. Then she stepped back. No one crowded the stall after that. Noah stood at the doorway. Ethan remained outside in the side run. Lila sank quietly onto an overturned bucket, her camera untouched in her lap. The humans had done everything their science allowed. What remained was older than treatment, older than plans, older even than grief put into words. As evening fell, a low, golden light entered through the open corridor and spread across Ruby's bedding. For one brief moment, it caught in her eye and made her look almost awake again. Milo responded instantly, touching her face, then her shoulder, then returning to the same place on her forehead as though memory had taught him exactly where comfort lived. He gave a soft, rolling rumble, and this time Ruby answered with the faintest vibration anyone had heard all day. The sound broke something open in the air. It was so slight it might have been missed by people who did not love her already. But Milo felt it. His ears lifted. He leaned closer, almost sheltering her with the front of his body. Outside, the sun sank lower, and the first blue of evening gathered beyond the fence line. Hannah would remember later that no one looked at the clock. Time had narrowed to breath, touch, and the unbearable hope of one more response. Sometime in the early dark, Ruby exhaled and did not fully return. Her chest rose once, shallow and uncertain. Then again, smaller still. Milo's trunk remained on her forehead, unmoving except for a gentle tightening at the tip, as if he were trying to hold her to the earth by tenderness alone. When her final breath slipped free, it was almost soundless. But Milo knew. Before any human did, he knew. What came out of him then was not the cry of a frightened calf. It was deep, resonant, and so full of sorrow that it seemed to pass through the metal, the walls, the very ground beneath the preserve. The call rolled outward into the night, and for a heartbeat, there was only that grief, vast and living. Then, from a distant enclosure, another elephant answered. Then another. Low voices rose across the dark, like a chorus acknowledging loss. No one moved for a long time. Lila was crying openly now, the camera forgotten beside her. Ethan pressed both hands to his face and stared down at the dirt. Noah lowered his head. Grace stood near the doorway with tears running silently, her polished distance gone at last. Hannah remained where she was, one hand over her mouth, watching Milo keep vigil beside Ruby, as though love itself had made him older in a single breath. He did not step back from her body. He did not flinch or panic or try to run. He simply stayed. He touched her ear, then her cheek, then the curve of her neck with the slow, bewildered care of someone learning the shape of absence. Long after the last answering call faded from the preserve, Milo remained there beneath the dim corridor light, guarding Ruby in the first hours after death, as if leaving now would be the one betrayal he could not bear. Morning arrived softly, almost apologetically, laying a pale wash of light across the preserve, as if the day itself understood it was entering sacred ground. Ruby's body remained where she had died, wrapped in stillness, while Milo stood beside her exactly as the night had left him. Dew gathered on the straw. Dust settled along his legs. He had not stepped away long enough for anyone to believe he truly could. The humans kept their distance because instinct told them this grief did not belong to them first. Hannah had already made the decision before anyone asked. No one would rush the removal. No one would force Milo away for the sake of tidiness, schedule, or appearances. If elephants in the wild were allowed to mourn their dead in their own time, then Milo would be given the same dignity here, even if it unsettled everyone watching. He began the day by touching Ruby's face with a tenderness so measured it felt ceremonial. His trunk moved over the line of her brow, the fold of her ear, the place on her neck where warmth had once gathered beneath his touch. Every few minutes, he paused, as if listening for something too quiet for the human world. Then he would begin again, tracing her shape the way a blind heart might memorize what it was about to lose forever. He did not cry the way he had at the gate. The raw, broken sounds were gone. in their place came deep, low rumbles that rose from him at long intervals, less frantic now, more solemn. Each one rolled through the corridor like a note from some ancient language older than speech. Other elephants answered now and then from distant enclosures, not constantly, not loudly, but enough to make the preserve feel joined together by morning. Food was brought and left within reach. Milo barely noticed it. Water stood untouched for long stretches before Ethan quietly moved a trough closer to the mesh, hoping proximity might persuade him. Hannah worried, of course. He was still young. Grief could strip strength from a body already taxed by months of recovery. But each time someone took a step toward intervention, one look at the way Milo stood over Ruby made them stop. Some hungers had to wait. Lila filmed very little that first day. What she did record came in brief, respectful pieces. The angle of Milo's trunk resting over Ruby's shoulder, the way his feet shifted only enough to keep balance, the long stillness between movements. Later, she would say the hardest part was not the sadness itself. It was the dignity of it. Nothing about Milo's grief was wild or chaotic. It was patient, devoted, heartbreakingly deliberate. By afternoon, heat gathered under the roof panels and pressed the smell of straw, damp earth, and old wood into the air. Milo finally drank a little, but only after touching Ruby once more, as if asking permission to do what the living must do. He took a few mouthfuls, returned immediately, and resumed his vigil. That small act relieved the humans more than they admitted. It meant he was still tethered, however faintly, to survival. The second night passed in much the same hush as the first, but something subtle changed by dawn. Milo began moving in slow circles around Ruby's body, never far, never hurried. He would pause at her head, then at her side, then behind her, touching the ground where she had lain and lifting his trunk to test the air. Noah, watching from the doorway, murmured that this mirrored field observations of wild elephants confronting death. Hannah only nodded. The science mattered, but not more than the moment. On the third morning, the first real turning came. Milo walked away from Ruby's body without prompting and crossed to the water trough on his own. The movement was so quiet, so unannounced, that Lila almost missed it. He drank for a long time. Then he stood beneath the shade for several minutes, looking not toward the gate and not toward the horizon, but back toward the place where Ruby lay. It was not abandonment. It was acknowledgement. That was when Hannah knew the next step could happen, though even then she delayed until the light was thin and gentle. The removal would be done at first dawn the following day, before the preserve fully woke, with as little noise as possible. Ben consulted local elders the night before and returned with a simple piece of advice that stayed with them all. Do not take the dead in violence, and do not separate the living from their farewell too quickly. So they planned everything around quiet. When the hour came, the team moved like shadows. Milo was led, not by force, but by Ethan's steady presence and a trail of fresh-cut branches just far enough from the corridor to hold his attention for a few minutes. It was the only moment in those days that felt like betrayal, and everyone who took part in it carried that sting. Yet when Milo returned and found the bedding empty, he did not panic. He stood in the doorway and grew very still. He approached the bare place slowly, trunk lowered, and examined the straw, the earth, the faint impressions Ruby's body had left behind. He touched the ground again and again, then released a soft, breathy rumble, unlike any sound he had made before. It was not a cry for her to return. It felt more like an answer to something only he understood. Hannah watched from the far wall, with tears burning her eyes, and thought, with sudden certainty, that Milo knew Ruby was gone. The days that followed did not heal him all at once. He moved through them with a subdued quiet that made his youth seem older than it was. But grief no longer held him in one place. He began eating more steadily. He accepted water without coaxing. He allowed Ethan to walk him through the outer lane again. Though each time they passed the corridor where Ruby had died, he slowed and reached his trunk toward the space she had once occupied. Memory had not loosened. It had simply changed shape. Weeks later, when the rear gate was opened again under a calmer sky, Milo walked to it on his own. The handlers held their breath, afraid to hope too quickly. He paused at the threshold exactly where he had once frozen, but this time the stillness felt different. Not fear, not refusal. He turned his head once toward the back wing, toward the place where grief had remade him, then faced the open land, ahead. And at last, without tears, Milo stepped forward. The ending no one could have planned unfolded slowly after that. Milo was not only released back toward the wild, he carried Ruby with him in ways the humans would keep discovering. Months later, tracking reports would show him lingering beside weaker calves, slowing his pace for older females, watching over the vulnerable with a patience no one had taught in training. Ruby had not survived to walk out beside him, but the tenderness she gave him had, and in the end, that was the gift that made his freedom possible. If Milo's story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments. If you believe animals feel love and loss just like we do, comment love. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more unforgettable stories still ahead. Stories of loyalty, survival, heartbreak, and hope that you won't want to miss.